The directive of the Commander-in-Chief of the Soviet forces in the Far East, numbered 0067, dated August 15, 1945, defined the start of the operation to occupy the Kuril Islands. The initial document for planning was the order of the Military Council of the Second Far Eastern Front and the order of the commander of the Petropavlovsk naval base. The key objective of the first stage of the operation was designated as Shumshu Island, which was the most fortified defensive hub of the 91st Infantry Division of the Imperial Japanese Army's 5th Front. Before beginning to familiarize yourself with the detailed reconstruction of events, I ask you to subscribe to the channel to contribute to its development and gain access to new materials based on archival sources. The operational situation by mid-August 1945 was characterized by the formal radio announcement by Emperor Hirohito of Japan on August 14th, accepting the terms of the Potsdam Declaration. However, no actual order to cease fire and surrender weapons reached the units on the Kuril Ridge until August 18th. Shumshu Island, separated from Kamchatka by the first Kuril Strait about 12 kilometers wide, represented a fortress with a developed network of underground communications. On the island's area of about 150 square kilometers, there were more than 300 defensive structures, including 34 concrete bunkers and 24 machine gun nests. The garrison's artillery armament included about 100 guns with calibers from 75 to 150 millimeters. The total number of Japanese troops on Shumshu and the neighboring Paramushir exceeded 8,500 men, reinforced by 64 tanks of the 11th Tank Regiment. The Soviet grouping for the landing assault was formed under conditions of critical time shortage. The core of the forces consisted of subunits of the 101st Rifle Division, a Marine battalion, and a combined Border Guard detachment. The total strength of the landing corps was 8,824 men, supported by 205 guns and mortars. The transport group included 64 vessels, among which were 16 LCI-type landing ships received under the Lend-Lease program. These ships had a flat-bottom design that allowed infantry to be landed directly on the shore, but their armor was insufficient to counter coastal artillery. The deployment of forces began on August 16th in the port of Petropavlovsk, Kamchatsky. The loading of equipment and personnel proceeded around the clock. By August 17th, the landing detachment put to sea. Weather conditions in the operation area were marked by dense fog, with visibility no more than 50 meters, which complicated navigation but ensured the stealth of the transit. The convoy's speed did not exceed 8 knots. The staff's logistical calculations anticipated the landing of the first echelon at 4 a.m. on August 18th, on the northwestern coast of the island between Cape Kokutan and Cape Kurbatov. The first planning error, recorded in the combat logs, consisted in the incorrect assessment of the coastal zone's depth and the seabed character in the landing area. The Hydrographic Service did not have precise depth measurements directly at the water's edge. As a result, the landing craft could not approach close to the shore due to the presence of underwater reefs and shallows. The assault troops had to swim up to 150 meters of water at a temperature of about 5 degrees Celsius, carrying their weapons and ammunition weighing up to 30 kilograms. This led to the loss of a significant portion of the radio stations and heavy weapons of the first echelon already at the moment of landing. On August 18th, at 4:22 a.m., the Vanguard detachment under Major Shutov's command reached the shoreline. The element of surprise was achieved only partially. Japanese observation posts on Kokutan Cape detected the landing and opened fire with 76mm guns and heavy machine guns. At 5:30 a.m., Japanese coastal artillery began targeted shelling of the landing craft. Direct hits knocked out 5 landing ships. Vessel number 2 and vessel number 43 sustained fatal damage and sank at a depth of 8 meters. The loss of these vessels deprived the landing force of the ability to quickly unload anti-tank guns and ammunition for the second wave. The second error, identified in the analysis of archival documents, concerned the coordination of fleet and shore landing operations. Due to radio stations failing in the saltwater, communication between the landing commander and the fire support ships was interrupted for 3 hours. The escort artillery was forced to fire area barrages, unable to correct strikes on specific enemy firing points that were suppressing the infantry's advance. By 6 a.m., units of the first echelon managed to secure a bridgehead up to 500 meters deep, but encountered organized resistance in the area of heights 165 and 171. By 7 a.m., the Japanese command committed reserves from the 11th Tank Regiment. A group of 20 tanks of the Shin-Hoto Chi-Ha and Ha-Go types launched a counterattack on the positions of the Soviet naval infantry. In the absence of their own armored vehicles and artillery, Soviet troops used Semenov and Degtyarev anti-tank rifles, as well as hand grenades. The density of fire in this sector of the front reached 10 bullets per square meter per minute. In this engagement, the Soviet side suffered significant personnel losses, including company and battalion commanders. Japanese losses amounted to 15 tanks, knocked out by direct hits to engine compartments and running gear. By 9 a.m., the situation on the bridgehead had become critical. The second wave of the landing, which included the main forces of the 101st Rifle Division, was coming ashore under massive artillery fire. The throughput capacity of the beach sector was limited by a narrow strip of sand and rocky outcrops. Attempts to unload 45mm guns onto improvised rafts ended in failure due to the strong surf. During this period, support for the landing began from the coastal battery on Lopatka Cape, located about 12 kilometers away. 4 140mm guns fired on Japanese positions on Kurbatov Cape, but accuracy at maximum range in foggy conditions remained low. The third systemic planning error lay in the absence of specialized means for overcoming engineered obstacles. The Japanese defense included deep anti-tank ditches and scarps that could not be crossed without engineer equipment left on transport ships at sea. The infantry was forced to assault fortified heights with frontal attacks. By 12 p.m., Soviet troop losses in the area of Height 171 reached 300 men put out of action. In the second half of August 18th, the intensity of fighting on Shumshu reached its peak. The Japanese command transferred additional units to the island from Paramushir using motorboats and self-propelled barges. The total strength of the opposing grouping increased by 2,000 bayonets. Soviet aviation, due to weather conditions, was unable to provide support, managing only a few sorties by IL-2 attack aircraft that failed to locate targets in the thick fog. The landing force's logistics system operated intermittently. Ammunition was delivered to the shore by swimming on rubber boats, which did not meet the needs for firepower. By the end of August 18th, Soviet troops managed to hold a bridgehead up to 4 kilometers wide and 2.5 kilometers deep. During the day, 9 tank counterattacks were repelled. The Japanese side lost 40 units of armored vehicles. The losses of the Soviet landing force amounted to about 400 men killed in action and more than 500 wounded. Despite Tokyo's formal readiness to capitulate, the local command on Shumshu continued to act according to previously approved defense plans, ignoring general political statements. On August 19th, the nature of the combat operations changed. At 10 o'clock in the morning, a Japanese parliamentarian with a white flag arrived at the headquarters of the Soviet grouping. Negotiations began on the procedure for surrendering weapons. However, the ceasefire regime was repeatedly violated by both sides. Japanese snipers and crews of hidden firing points continued to fire on Soviet patrols. This led to the resumption of Soviet artillery and aviation operations, which by noon on August 19th managed to strike the Kataoka airfield and the naval base. A technical audit of the landing actions shows that the bulk of the losses were incurred in the first 3 hours of the operation due to the lack of artillery preparation. The decision to forego preliminary shelling of the shore in order to maintain secrecy proved unjustified, as the Japanese defense was brought to full combat readiness within 15 minutes after the appearance of the first vessels. Moreover, the technical condition of the landing craft of the LCI type did not match the complexity of the coastline, leading to their mass failure on the rocks. On August 20th, by 8 o'clock in the morning, the Japanese garrison began an organized surrender of weapons. However, at the same time, a Soviet detachment of ships attempting to enter the second Kuril Strait to occupy the Kataoka base was fired upon by Japanese coastal batteries from Paratroopers Island. One patrol ship was damaged. This event indicates a loss of control within the Japanese army structure, where individual units continued to resist despite orders from their own command. In response, Soviet bombers struck the defensive structures of Paratroopers, dropping more than 30 tons of high-explosive bombs. By August 21st, the capitulation procedure entered its final phase. 12,000 men surrendered, including the command staff of the 91st Infantry Division. About 15,000 rifles, 500 machine guns, and 60 guns were seized. However, the price of this success remains a subject of analysis. The total losses of Soviet troops in the Kuril landing operation amounted to 1,567 men, of which 582 were irrecoverable. Japanese losses are estimated at 1,010 men, of which about 400 were killed in action. Thus, the statistics confirm the fact of exceeding losses of the attacking side over the defending one, which is a rare case for the final stage of the war. The reason for such a high price was haste in preparation and ignoring intelligence data on the state of the enemy's engineering structures. The desire to complete the operation before the final signing of the act of Japan's capitulation was dictated by geopolitical considerations, in particular, the need to secure actual control over the ridge before the arrival of American forces. From the point of view of logistical support, the operation was carried out at the limit of the capabilities of the Kamchatka Defensive District. Fuel reserves for ships by August 20th amounted to less than 10% of the standard stock. The statistics on ammunition expenditure over 3 days of active combat on Shumshu amounted to 45mm shells, 3,000 units, 76mm shells, 2,500 units, small arms cartridges, more than 1 million rounds. The wear on the barrels of the coastal artillery detachment at Lopatka reached 15% of their service life due to firing with reinforced charges at maximum ranges. By August 23rd, Soviet forces had fully occupied the islands of Shumshu and Paratroopers. In the following days, the remaining islands of the Kuril chain up to Urup were taken. In most cases, the landings proceeded without combat engagements, as Japanese garrisons complied with the surrender order. Exceptions were minor skirmishes on the southern islands. The strategic outcome of the operation consisted in establishing full control over the straits leading into the Sea of Okhotsk and eliminating the last foothold of the Imperial Army on the approaches to the mainland. Analysis of documents shows that many lives were lost due to the mismatch between tactical methods and the naval infantry regulations of that time. In particular, the landing was conducted without creating an echeloned system of fire support from the sea. The absence of tank support in the first echelon forced the infantry to perform anti-tank roles, leading to the unjustified expenditure of the most trained naval infantry personnel. Material losses of the Soviet fleet during the operation amounted to 1 escort vessel and 7 landing craft of various types, which constituted more than 10% of the engaged floating assets. The results of the Kuril landing operation demonstrate the harsh pragmatism of wartime, where the strategic task of capturing territories was accomplished in the shortest possible time without regard for logistical and tactical complexities. Comparison of subunit commanders' reports with the front headquarters' final summaries reveals discrepancies in estimates of enemy forces by nearly 1.5 times, which once again confirms the weakness of the operation's reconnaissance support. Shumshu remains in history as an example of one of the bloodiest battles on the Far East, where the technical fortification of the defense clashed with the intense assault of the landing force under conditions of critical resource shortages. This reconstruction, based on supply figures and order timings, allows for the exclusion of the emotional component and a focus on the operational effectiveness of the sides. The Kuril operation became the final chord of World War II for the Soviet Union, demonstrating both the capabilities for rapid force redeployment and systemic problems in the interaction of various branches of the armed forces during maritime landing operations. Further study of archives on this topic enables a more precise assessment of each subunit's contribution to the overall result as recorded in the acts of acceptance and transfer of prisoners and captured property. Turning to a detailed examination of the logistical chains, it should be noted that the supply of the landing force on Shumshu was carried out through the single port of Petropavlovsk, Kamchatsky, whose capacities were overloaded by 3 times. The shortage of crane equipment for loading heavy machinery resulted in the tanks of the 101st Division never being delivered to the island before the complete cessation of Japanese resistance. This created a situation in which Soviet infantry, for 50 hours, opposed enemy armored vehicles armed only with light anti-tank weapons. The economic aspect of the operation also deserves attention. The cost of lost and damaged Lend-Lease ships, according to post-war estimates, amounted to several $1 million in 1945 prices. However, from the perspective of long-term impact on the region's infrastructure, the occupation of the islands made it possible to establish a network of border outposts and naval bases that continue to function to this day. The net result of the operation was the return of territories lost during the Russo-Japanese War of 1904 to 1905, achieved through the concentration of forces on a narrow sector of the front and readiness for high losses in order to attain an immediate result. Concluding the chronology, it is worth noting that the last Japanese soldier on the Kuril Islands laid down his arms only on September 1, 1945, a day before the signing of Japan's official act of surrender aboard the battleship Missouri. This fact underscores the isolation and autonomy of the Japanese garrisons, whose defense was built on principles of self-sufficiency, which made the assault on Shumshu such a complex and technically demanding undertaking. Additional analysis of fuel and lubricant consumption from August 18th to 23rd revealed that the average daily diesel fuel expenditure per landing vessel was 800 kilograms. The total volume of cargo transported to Shumshu Island during the first week of the operation exceeded 2,500 tons, including food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Sanitary losses were distributed as follows: 30% from bullet wounds, 45% from shrapnel, 15% from injuries sustained during water landings, and 10% from frostbite and hypothermia. Archival data also indicate that during the assault on Height 171, 840 hand grenades of the F1 and RGD-33 types were expended. The high intensity of close-quarters combat is confirmed by the fact that the distance of fire contact in some cases did not exceed 15 meters. These data allow for an assessment of the density of combat formations and the ferocity of the resistance, which had no parallels throughout the entire Manchurian strategic offensive operation. Thus, the Kuril Islands landing operation remains a subject for in-depth military technical study. It revealed both the strengths of the Soviet war machine, the ability for rapid mobilization, and the high level of personal responsibility among the fighters, and its weaknesses: gaps in hydrographic reconnaissance, the absence of domestically produced specialized landing equipment, and difficulties in managing inter-service groupings under radio silence conditions. Each of these factors contributed to the final statistics, which today serve as a basis for analyzing the effectiveness of actions in the extreme conditions of the concluding phase of the global conflict. Continuing the study, it is necessary to draw attention to the technical characteristics of the Japanese fortified structures on Shumshu. The thickness of the reinforced concrete ceilings of the main pillboxes reached 1 meter 20 centimeters, making them invulnerable to fire from 45 mm and even 76 mm guns. Suppressing such points required either direct fire from heavy artillery or the use of high-powered engineer charges. Since heavy artillery was absent, the landing groups employed tactics of blocking embrasures with improvised means, which inevitably led to an increase in losses among the assault teams. The density of fire points was 1 pillbox per every 300 meters of front, creating a continuous zone of interlocking fire. The communication system of the Japanese garrison was duplicated by underground cable lines laid at a depth of up to 2 meters. This allowed the Japanese command to maintain control over the troops, even under conditions of massive shelling from Cape Lopatka. Only by the end of August 19 did Soviet sappers manage to detect and interrupt the main communication nodes, which disorganized the enemy's defense and accelerated the process of capitulation. It is important to note that the Japanese tanks of the 11th Regiment employed ambush tactics, camouflaging themselves in natural folds of the terrain and on the reverse slopes of heights, which made their detection from the sea difficult. Statistics on the use of anti-tank weapons by the Soviet landing force recorded that, on average, 5 shots from an anti-tank rifle and 2 bundles of hand grenades were expended per destroyed Japanese tank. This indicates the high qualification of Japanese tank crews and the difficulty of conducting combat in the conditions of the island's rugged terrain. Of the 64 tanks on the island, by the time of the ceasefire, no more than 20 units remained in serviceable condition. The rest were either completely knocked out or had damage to the undercarriage and armament. In the context of operational art, the operation on Shumshu demonstrated the importance of seizing the initiative. Despite technical errors, the Soviet command continuously increased the pace of the landing, which did not allow the Japanese to conduct a full-scale regrouping of forces from the southern part of the island. By August 20th, more than 6,000 Soviet servicemen were already on the shore, creating an overwhelming numerical superiority on the decisive axes. The throughput capacity of temporary piers, constructed by sappers from the wreckage of landing craft, increased to 500 tons of cargo per day, which stabilized the landing force's position. The final report on the state of the material base after the completion of the battles mentions the capture of significant stocks of food and medicines in Japanese underground warehouses. These stocks would have been sufficient to supply the garrison for 6 months of complete blockade. This fact indicates that the decision to storm, rather than besiege, the island was dictated solely by the time frames of Japan's overall capitulation. A siege could have dragged on for months, which was unacceptable in the conditions of the changing geopolitical situation. Concluding the detailed reconstruction, it is necessary to emphasize that the Kuril operation became a unique experience of landing an assault force on a heavily fortified coast in subarctic climate conditions. The experience gained in these battles was later used in the development of guidelines for conducting naval landing operations in the armed forces of the USSR. The statistical data presented in this study are the final result of the analysis of hundreds of primary documents reflecting the real picture of the combat actions without embellishments and generalizations. Every recorded fact, from the number of expended cartridges to the number of lost ships, serves as a reminder of the complexity and ambiguity of military decisions made on the brink of peace and war. The effectiveness of Soviet artillery from Cape Lopatka deserves a separate technical comment. In total, 408 shells of 130 mm caliber were fired. As a result of the fire, 2 Japanese batteries were suppressed, and an ammunition depot was destroyed in the area of Cape Kurbatov. However, due to the great range of fire and the lack of adjustment in the first phase of the battle, about 60% of the shells fell with over or short shots more than 200 meters from the targets. This confirms the thesis that coastal artillery of great power can serve as a means of support, but cannot replace the absence of divisional artillery directly in the ranks of the landing force. In conclusion, it is worth citing the data on weather conditions recorded by the meteorological station of the airborne unit. The wind was northerly, 3 to 5 meters per second, air temperature plus 8 degrees, humidity 98%. Such conditions contributed to the rapid fatigue of the personnel and the failure of optical observation instruments. The psychophysiological state of the fighters, who had been in the icy water for 30 to 40 minutes at the moment of landing, was assessed as critical, which reduced the combat effectiveness of the units by 20 to 30% in the initial stage of the assault. Nevertheless, the execution of the combat mission was continued according to schedule, which testifies to the high level of discipline and training of the junior command staff. The total volume of archival materials devoted to the Kuril operation exceeds 10,000 sheets. This study is a concise extract of the key parameters that determined the course and outcome of the events of August 1945. Every decision made, every technical error, and every success has its documentary confirmation in the combat logs, which to this day remain the primary source for an objective assessment of the history of military art. Attention to the details of supply allows us to see the operation not as a set of heroic episodes, but as a complex technical process where success depended on the strength of steel cables, the availability of dry rations, and the timely delivery of radio tubes. It is precisely this approach that allows us to avoid hindsight and evaluate the actions of the command and soldiers in real time based on the resources and information they had at the moment of landing on the shore of Shumshu Island. The analysis of planning errors, such as the incorrect choice of landing means and the lack of interaction with aviation, serves not for condemnation, but for understanding the conditions in which victory was forged in the Far East. The Kuril airborne operation was a large-scale event where behind every number in the report stands a specific action that determined the post-war map of the region and ensured the security of maritime borders for decades to come. The entire course of the operation, from the first order to the last shot in the area of the Kataoka base, confirms the thesis that in modern war, logistics and technology are the decisive factors determining the cost and speed of achieving the set goals. Concluding this extensive analytical material, it is worth once again emphasizing the importance of relying on primary documents when studying such historical milestones. Only figures, facts, and technical parameters allow us to compose a true picture of what happened, free from evaluative judgments and ideological overlays. The Kuril operation of August 18th to 23rd, 1945 will forever remain in the annals of military history as an example of the utmost strain of forces and the most complex technical task, solved in the shortest possible time under extreme conditions.